Welcome to Biocanic's Health Intelligence Exchange community, where leading practitioners in integrative health approaches will discuss how they solve the most challenging and common health issues. These regular Q&A discussions are designed to take a deep dive into case studies and integrative approaches in order to elevate the collective knowledge of both experienced and new practitioners alike. Biocanic's Health Intelligence Exchange, your community for functional medicine.
Hello, hello. Welcome everybody to the Health Intelligence Exchange. I'm Lainey Gray, and today our guest is Kara Siedman, Chief Medical Officer for ResBiotic. She's here today to discuss all things microbiome and all the products with ResBiotic, but I want to talk a little bit about her first. She's a registered dietitian and certified diabetes care and education specialist with over 15 years of clinical experience in inpatient care, outpatient program development, and integrative and functional nutrition. Her work in a leading gastroenterology practice sparked a root cause focus and a specialty in the gut microbiome, leading to collaborations with top microbiome companies. At ResBiotic, Kara serves as the Vice President of Partnerships and Science, educating healthcare providers on microbiome science and the clinical use of targeted pre, pro, and postbiotics. And she is known for translating complex research into clear, actionable guidance that clinicians can apply in real-world care. Welcome, Kara. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this conversation. We ran into each other at a conference. It was like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? So I'm so excited that you're here to tell us about it.
I know, because we've met years ago, yes, right?
All about microbiome. We've been in this circle for a minute. Mm-hmm. So before we get started, though, I want to give you a little shout out because I just heard that your company won an award. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm so excited. So we just won Startup of the Year by NutraIngredients, which is a very reputable organization publication in the supplements, recognizing science and innovation in the space. So I'm excited to talk more about Res, what we're doing and the microbiome, but that was really exciting.
Oh, congratulations. That is amazing and really good to hear. All right, so let's dive in. You started in clinical dietetics and diabetes care before microbiome became your focus. What was the moment in that GI practice that shifted your approach toward more of a root cause first approach?
It actually started way before that. It's really why I became a dietitian. I was pre-med. I wanted to be a doctor, and then I realized don't really want to touch people. But I was always into natural health. That's always been a focus of mine. It was always an interest of mine. And when I learned about nutrition, and I really viewed nutrition as that bridge between more allopathic and Eastern medicine and more integrative care. And so it really drew me to the field of dietetics and having nutrition be my focus. But interestingly enough, I was very much into the microbiome before we even understood the microbiome. And I was that weird kid in college who had an entire kitchen full of fermented food. And I was really into fermentation and enzyme expression and learning more about this kind of ancient form of nutrition. And especially as I was in, so it's maybe serendipitous. Maybe there was a contract written about me that I was going to end up in the microbiome space, but I didn't even learn about the microbiome in school. And it's no surprise that I ended up in it as a profession. But when I got into the GI clinic, what that really did for me was separate this sort of world within. And I used to say to the GI docs, the digestive tract, but I work beneath that layer. And it was a beautiful relationship because diagnostically, we can work through some of the things that you have to rule out in the GI space. And I got to work with an extensive group of patients from obviously GI issues all the way through autoimmune, because your microbiome is your foundation. Everything kind of comes back to the gut. So I think it's always been part of my written contract. I married a brewer. My whole world's revolved around bugs. So
I love it. I love it. That's amazing. So let's talk a little bit about ResBiotic. It is built almost entirely around the microbiome. Mm-hmm. So for those practitioners who are listening today and meeting the company for the first time, how do you describe what ResBiotic set out to solve.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure many practitioners haven't heard of us. We are really such a new company. And not only that, we're new to the practitioner space. I really just built out this channel less than a year ago. But I actually learned about Res kind of early on because they launched the first lung probiotic. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more because we don't often think about the gut and lungs in the same breath. But we're founded by a neonatologist, early NIH-funded researcher who's actually one of the first groups and research groups to actually discover that the lungs have a unique microbiome. And that was really where his research started in the NICU, trying to figure out, why certain babies were developing secondary respiratory causes. And respiratory issues is the leading cause of death in the NICU. And it led them to the lung microbiome. So he saw this opportunity to really bring this gut-lung access to the forefront of consumer health. And he actually started a pharmaceutical company that's working on live biotherapeutics. But he's not a functional guy, not in the supplement space, and really wanted to, really saw this opportunity to bridge a gap. And I think that's really what ResBiotic is here to do. We bridge the gap between what we see working very well in the pharmaceutical industry, meaning scientific rigor, finished product validation, but it's expensive, it's inaccessible. Whereas what we see lacking in the consumer space, in the supplement space, which is trust. We know that more than 95% of consumers want more science-backed products. So we built ResBiotic to really, truly fill that gap. And what's so unique about us, and we'll talk more about it, is we take pharmaceutical level rigor and we apply it to all of our formulations and emphasize and prioritize this finished product validation across our entire product suite. So we're built on the microbiome. Our platform is actually what we call the GXPP, the GutX product platform, or what we call the GutX Access, because we understand our microbiome truly is foundational, and there's not one condition that's not linked back to what's actually happening in the microbiome. And all these different axes, from gut lung to gut brain to gut hormone to gut liver, all of these different axes, it's bidirectional. And majority of the modulation and ability to actually have significant impact is what we can do through microbiome modulation. So we have this vertically integrated platform where we do extensive research. We are a biotech company. These are all of our own strains that we're bringing to market. So we do first in lab or in vitro testing, where we actually grow out what's called organoids. And I think people, especially those of us that are all in this sort of science and healthcare space, it's very fascinating if you've ever done research. This is a very specialized state-of-the-art technology where we're growing out organs, so human cell organs, obviously in lab. And that's how we can actually see the system-specific impact of our biotics. We do this on all of our probiotics and postbiotics, but also all of our products combine bioactives, herbs, vitamins, and minerals. So we also do the same type of organoid testing to make sure we're seeing that same clinical impact. We want to know there's synergy, there's compatibility, but then we complete this on the finished product so that obviously the finished product has greater efficacy. This is how they do it in drug development. But then we follow everything up with human clinical trials. And this is our platform. This is what we do from start to finish on every single product that we put out into the market. So we're not only understanding mechanism, but then we're able to translate mechanism into real world impact.
Thank you for breaking that down. I think people don't really understand how much goes into developing a product and where you're starting. So for you to break it down, that here's what we're trying to solve for, this is what we're looking at, this is how we're putting this together, and then how we're actually testing the finished product. Because
a lot of companies don't do it.
Yeah, right. That's what you're saying. A lot of times you get a product that hasn't even been tested individually, and they're saying, oh, these things all work together, or they work, so let's put them together, without actually testing if that's going to work.
Or individual ingredients, yes. Right? So you're taking individual ingredients. So you're like, okay, I know that if I put lettuce and a cucumber and this, like I could form a salad, but does it always turn out to be a salad? No. Do you have the right balance so that the salad actually tastes and provides what you want? And I think that is a nuance. And that's why we saw this opportunity to sort of shift the narrative of what quality means. And especially in the biotic space, where when you start to combine different bugs together, there's competition. When you start to add in herbs and other bioactives, there's formulation struggles that can come up. And so you really have to be knowledgeable, and you really have to make sure then that in my opinion, that finished product, I mean, I speaks to my evidence-based heart. And it really helps when you are doing this type of precision and targeted care that we're seeing that specific targeted outcome.
Wonderful. Well, let's go back and set the foundation a little bit about the gut microbiome.
Oh, yeah.
But when we talk about gut microbiome, and we talked about it being linked to everything, right? There's a direction, it goes everywhere in the system. It's not independent. When we talk about the gut microbiome and metabolic health, what is actually happening in the gut that can influence the rest of the body?
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest topics of conversation given sort of the metabolic landscape that we live in. Epidemic, right? We know that like 90% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. And so despite advancements in technology and medications and knowledge, like we still see these conditions getting worse. And this is where the microbiome's offered such an incredible opportunity and advancements in science and health that we hear it all the time. We're just the tip of the iceberg, but truly our microbiome is our foundation. So I kind of think of it as like the foundation to a home. And you can have the best, most beautiful home in the world that has everything you've ever wanted, but we wait patiently for that inspection report to come back. Because if that inspection report comes back showing that you have cracks in your foundation, well, when that tornado comes or that hurricane comes, your house, your structure isn't going to be so resilient or stable. And that's truly how the microbiome functions in the body. So when it comes to metabolic health, whether it's weight changes or diabetes or metabolic syndrome or food cravings and brain fog and joint pain, like all these things that we see being linked back, we actually see microbial changes. We see dysbiosis or imbalance. And this is a lot of where the microbiome research is being focused on, is changes in what we know of a healthy microbiome to do. And it's not so much, oh, you don't have this certain microbe. Maybe you have a consortium of microbes that's producing less short-chain fatty acids, more these compounds that we know are so beneficial for metabolic health, for system-wide health. But those changes that are happening in the microbiome are disrupting the mucosal barrier, the integrity of the gut barrier. So the microbiome's not so protected. Well, now we can have compounds and constituents leak into bloodstream and start to drive systemic inflammation. But what that really translates to is that your microbiome stops functioning the way it should. And that's really what the microbiome space and research is sort of coming to, is you might not have every house in the neighborhood filled, and it might not be filled with the types of neighbors you want to live with, but at least the neighborhood's still functioning the way a neighborhood should function. When that neighborhood stops functioning the way it should is when we start to see problems. And that's why I think precision microbiome care, it's not so much about, oh, you have to take this microbe because maybe it shows undetectable levels. It's more about, well, what functions aren't being carried out that's now driving systemic changes and symptoms and conditions and issues. So when it comes to metabolic health, we see these sort of microbial signatures. And in fact, it actually translates to a microbiome that's thriftier. A thriftier microbiome is a microbiome that can actually extract more food from the same calories that someone else might be eating. It's a lack of short-chain fatty acid production. It's a driver of low-grade systemic, low-grade chronic inflammation. And so when we start to think about how we are approaching metabolic health and how we talk about metabolic health and flexibility, so much of what's being talked about and looked at, GLP-1 and all these neuroendocrine hormones, the production of these are influenced by what's happening in the microbiome. So if we can actually bring more targeted support and start to actually support our foundation or work the foundational aspect of the microbiome, we can actually improve signaling so that our body starts to respond to these hormones that are being produced. And that's a lot of the work we've done. We have a postbiotic that actually promotes GLP-1, and we wrapped up our clinical trial and we're in publication review for that. But it's not so much like, oh, you're replacing with this very specific microbe. It's that we're replacing a function that's clearly not being carried out.
Okay, that's amazing. Thank you for breaking that down as well, because that's where I was going to go next, right? So when in metabolic health, GLP-1 has become a household term, right? Because of the medications that are readily available to everyone. But before we talk about drugs, what is GLP?
Yeah.
And what is it doing in the body? Where does it come from? How is it related to gut health?
And I think, a lot of practitioners, obviously, we understand this, that we naturally produce GLP-1. It's an incretin hormone that plays a role in appetite and satiety. It's like what signals the brain to say, hey, like, stop eating, you're full. And it's produced by our intestinal L cells. So this is within the gastrointestinal tract, that production is actually influenced by the microbial signals that are or are not happening from the microbiome. And there's various signals. Like we know there's certain microbes that can signal. There's also short chain fatty acids. There's a lot of different processes, but so much of it comes down to if your microbiome is able to provide that very specific function. And so when we start to see metabolic shifts, I think about patients I work with all the time that are eating well and exercising and not seeing metabolic changes that they should. Like, to me, we really always have to think about the microbiome because could this person have dysbiosis that's starting to shift the way those signals are being produced or those hormones are being produced, where your body's now not responding to it. So the GLP-1s have been around for a very, very long time. I've worked in diabetes. We've been using these forever. And then, of course, it's become popularized. And I think this is good because it's really given front and center spotlight on the metabolic epidemic that we have and that we're in. But the reality is when we take these medications, and as successful as they are, and in fact, there's actually great research coming out on GLP-1 medications on some of the microbiome changes that they're providing, but even GLP-1 response. So are we responding to these medications is actually linking back to what's happening in the microbiome. So if you have a non-responder, it could actually be because there's a consortium of bacteria or there's a function that's not being carried out. And so that's more research that's going on. But when we take GLP-1 medications, we're taking them at super physiological levels, 1,000 times the amount that your body naturally produces. So we eat, we release GLP-1, which kind of has a half-life of 2 to 3 minutes, and then it falls. But in that 2 to 3 minutes, the brain gets signaled and everything should be saying, hey, stop eating, you're full, right? And of course, it's a more complicated process, but in simple terms, that's what should be happening when we take GLP-1 medications. This is why it's a once-a-week medication, is we take it at a very high dose, which is why we get side effects and things like that. But outside of GLP-1 medications, even if it's having a positive impact on the microbiome, what are we doing from an interventional perspective, from a toolbox perspective to actually support people's microbiomes? Because what some of the research is really pointing towards and leading towards is if you modulate the microbiome, meaning you improve the health of the microbiome, you may in fact see more long-term sustainable results. So they've done research in gastric bypass. So whether I think about someone on GLP-1s or a surgical patient or someone who's actually just focusing on nutrition and exercise, there's the metabolic journey, and the microbiome is a key player in that metabolic journey.
Okay, thank you. I want to recap something you said and then kind of follow up. Because you mentioned, okay, all the microbiome is helping modulate all these different signals that are happening naturally in the body. And at some point, something goes is out of place, and we're not responding to the signals. So with the GLP-1, we're taking a medication, right, to do a job. But if the gut bacteria is not doing its job either, we could still have no results. We might not see a positive effect from the medication. Is that what you're saying?
Well, potentially. So there's people, they've done research, some pilot studies looking at people who aren't even responding. Like you have what's called a non-responder. Yeah. And they've done some microbiome assays to say, okay, maybe it's linked back to who's not there, who isn't there. Right. And so, but then I even think about people who are on GLP-1 medications and they hit a plateau, or let's say they are having such intense side effects and they don't want to dose up, or when you start to want to deprescribe, if you haven't improved metabolic flexibility at the root of where metabolic health is really being impacted, which is the microbiome, we're really missing out on an opportunity to support our patients for consumers to be supported in having success, whether on a medication or off. So even someone who's working on nutrition and exercise, I think microbiome needs to be part of it, because clearly there's metabolic dysfunction, and the microbiome is being impacted, if not contributing to, right? It's bidirectional, right? It's bidirectional.
So then just to follow up on that, so we're taking medication, we're taking support, we're doing our probiotics. But what I'm hearing you say is that we still have to be rebuilding the foundation.
Of course. I think there's not 100%. To me, if we aren't supporting the microbiome, especially in metabolic patients, we are missing out on something that's 100% foundational, that could be a big part of what's either inhibiting success or what will drive success.
Amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm going to jump with this because I know you have a product that supports
Yes.
this process. And I want you to talk about that. But when we talk about probiotics, there's a lot of confusion around what's a prebiotic, what's a probiotic, what's a postbiotic. Can you explain what role each of those play, how they're different, and what we need, why we might need them?
I know I was just on another webinar this morning talking about this, and I feel like you'll have to interrupt me because I'm about to take us down.
Let's do it. We are ready. We are ready.
Because I love this conversation. And I also think that being on there's only so much information as a patient or a consumer that you need to know. And ultimately you want to know what a product's doing to solve an issue or to support you in whatever you want to be supported. As a practitioner, I think it's our job to double click in and have a greater understanding. But then on a product side and formulation side, it's our job to really help and support the education piece. And so the microbiome space is evolving. I mean, it's such a new science. So we're constantly learning more. So of course, I'll start with prebiotics because I think this is the easiest one to understand. And prebiotics are not live microorganisms, but they are in fact food. It's the fertilizer for growth, right? It's what feeds your probiotics, the beneficial bacteria within the gut microbiomes. Think of a lot of your fibers. Now, not all fiber is a prebiotic fiber. Think of your resistant starch. So your green bananas or your rice that's been heated and cooled and heated, or your fructooligosaccharides, your onions and your garlics, your FODMAPs, right? A lot of us are so familiar with that term. These are selectively feeding your beneficial bacteria. So not all bacteria, like not all bifido are going to consume the same prebiotics. Akkermansia is not going to consume the same prebiotics. And so this is why fiber diversity is just so important in the diet. And not all fiber is going to feed your beneficial bacteria. So they're selectively utilized. And we know most people are not consuming enough fiber, despite fiber maxing being a thing in the social media world, right? I think less than 3% of Americans are actually consuming enough fiber. So we know that there's a problem in what we're actually giving the microbiome. We're starving it. And this can be a whole nother topic of conversation because we have a lot of diet philosophy out there, from paleo to carnivore to all these things that just make nutrition so much more complicated than I think it needs to be. With that being said, there are different types of fibers, and specifically these prebiotic fibers are what are selectively feeding your most important bacteria. So they're fertilizing the growth. It's how we actually produce short chain fatty acids, that end product of fermentation, your butyrate, your propionate, your acetate. That's just profoundly important throughout the entire body. So that's prebiotics.
Probiotics right there. Okay.
Yeah.
So you brought up food. So I think first and foremost, prebiotics are mostly obtained from food if we have just a natural setting, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, and we have more information that there are different types of foods outside of fibers that have prebiotic activity, which is great, but it's food. It's the fertilizer.
Perfect. Because now we see products that have prebiotic in them. And how do we know? We'll kind of dive into that later, but I just like to bring that back because as we talk about targeted anything and talking about supplements and probiotics, I like to make sure that we're not forgetting the foundation of eating real food. We need to eat.
I mean, and
you know what I mean?
Oh, for sure. And I think, to me, ultimately, and I'll talk about probiotics and postbiotics because these really, but in general, and I teach this to a lot of, dietitians that I mentor. Right. But when you think of a supplement, right, what's the definition of supplement? To replace something that's missing or to take instead of, right? Or I think of the definition to take at therapeutic or higher levels to achieve a therapeutic value, right? And that's the thing is, I take actually a bunch of different prebiotics, even though I emphasize fiber, but I have a 4-year-old. I can't have I used to do before I became a mom, and it was I'm going to choose 5 new plant foods a week to try. I can't do that now. It's I'm trying to only cook 1 meal. But even as someone who overemphasizes fiber in the diet, I take prebiotics because I don't actually get a ton of resistant starch. So I eat green bananas, but then they turn yellow. So I get 2 days of a green banana. And I am not someone who eats a ton of heated and cooled and reheated rice. It's just not my daughter doesn't eat rice or potatoes. Like,
Yeah.
so I'm stuck. But yeah, so I think of it as just like kind of that insurance policy that I want to make sure
Perfect.
I'm giving my bugs like exactly what they want.
Love that. Love that. All right. Probiotics. Tell us all about them.
So everyone knows probiotics. I feel like we can do a whole show on just like probiotic myths and what we now know. But as a basic terminology and definition, probiotics are your live microorganisms that, when consumed or taken in higher amounts, confer benefits, right? So we all have probiotics. These are the friendly neighbors that we want to live next to. This is the neighborhoods we want, to the people we want to move into our neighborhood. They're all there, right? Our microbiome's an ecosystem. So like any ecosystem, there's going to be shifting and changing, but everything hopefully is living in harmony. Your probiotics are, much more fragile, right? Because they're live. And one thing that is so important, this was such a big part of the conversation I had earlier today, is what we've come to learn in the microbiome space is when it comes down to what are these bugs doing? What kind of neighbor is actually living next to me? It really comes down to the strain. And so I usually use the analogy of like dogs, right? So all dogs are under the same species of canine. But when you look at then the individual strain, you've got your pit bull, you've got your Great Dane, you've got your West Highland Terrier. Clearly not the same. They don't look the same. They don't act the same. They don't bark the same. They don't eat the same things. It's the same thing. We're all Homo sapiens, but I am very different than you, Lainey. And it's the same thing with our bacteria. So if you look at an L. plantarum strain, those little letters and numbers that come after that is what designate the strain. And what companies like us and other biotech companies out there, ingredient companies that people are purchasing from, they're doing research on that specific strain. So strain determines function. What is that L. plantarum RSB11 strain doing in the body? Because you can't extrapolate what that L. plantarum strain does for another strain. So unless you're doing the research, you don't know. And so when you look at a probiotic and you just see Lactobacillus acidophilus listed out, to me that raises red flags. And what strain of acidophilus? Because they all can potentially function differently. And that's really where the microbiome space is moving, is strain specificity, so that you can create and formulate more targeted and precision products. So that's one of the biggest areas. It's not necessarily like you have the highest amount of probiotics in there, because you should really only necessarily be taking what's clinically efficacious. More isn't always better. And it also, when you don't do the research, when you combine a bunch of strains together, they can compete, and they can actually wipe each other out. And so this is where I think we have to challenge companies and product formulation in actually doing more finished product validation. This is why we do it. We want to make sure that we have synergy and compatibility.
Okay. Amazing. Because I'm going to then ask, for a long time, right, the recommendation was to get something with a lot of strains in it.
Yeah.
Right. To have 100 billion
Yeah.
of 20 strains.
I don't know if it's doing anything.
Yeah. Right.
Right. And in fact, like if I was to formulate, now we're going down like a whole rabbit hole, but I'll take us back to postbiotics in a second.
Yes, we will. That was my fault. I brought it up.
But like if I was to conduct a study and I was to formulate a product that had, 13 strains in it, with 100, I would be looking at function of one strain and then the function of individual strains. And then what happens when you combine two of them, and then you add a third one, and then you add a fourth one, because at some point those strains are going to start to compete for space. So are you paying for, a 23 strain product, but actually two of the strains are actually... So more often means that you're just paying more money and it's not more clinically impactful.
Okay. Fascinating. I think that's just important.
It is.
Yeah.
It is fascinating, because I think it's our job as practitioners to also do the double click in. It's, we get swept up in marketing and the sexiness of big names and cool things and what marketing teams do. But as a practitioner, I think it's our job to double click into the company and actually see what research is putting out and to ask these important questions, because we do have companies out there that are putting in the research, and why I really value finished product validation.
I love that. And I think what you said is just very important. The other piece of that is that, as you said, the research is changing. We're learning more and more all the time. So what the standard was 10 or 15 years ago,
Right.
12,
Technology is
13
advanced.
strains, right? That may not be the best item for your probiotic today,
Yeah.
because now we can actually do more. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's dive into postbiotics.
My favorite.
Tell us more.
I'm all about postbiotics. I think
Uh-huh.
for anyone that knows what a postbiotic is, I'm going to say that probiotics are dead, but that's essentially what a postbiotic is now.
Okay.
So I went on this morning because I actually think this is some of the most interesting research happening in the microbiome space right now, is trying to answer this question of what makes probiotics so beneficial. Because when we look at studies that have been done, this is coming out of like big microbiome research labs, like Stanford, Sonnenberg's lab, like the big microbiome, kind of guys out there and groups out there. And they do a lot of studies looking at comparison of microbiome modulation or changes from high fiber diets to then people consuming high fermentable food diets. And time again, fermented food actually modulates the microbiome sometimes greater. But when we look and really look at fermented food, like buying sauerkraut off the shelf in your grocery store, it's been sitting there, it's shelf stable. Are they actually alive, right? And this has really prompted now the research in the biotech community to say, okay, well, what happens? And in fact, the definition of postbiotics actually changed in 2017. We used to think of postbiotics as just the end product of fermentation, butyrate. And many of us take butyrate. I used butyrate all the time in practice, especially with my IBD patients and flared patients, right? So you can get kind of that direct inflammatory support. But then we started learning, okay, well, something's happening when these probiotics die, that they're still creating impact. And so the definition shifted to these inanimate microorganisms. So I think of it as a ghost. So they're viable but non-culturable. So they're not quite dead. They haven't crossed over completely, but they're not here. So ghosts are very intentional. Like if I had a ghost in my house right now, it would come and maybe knock my sparkling water off the desk. To make itself known. And so postbiotics, these are heat treated or heat inactivated or pasteurized, right? So they're basically heat killed probiotics. And what we've learned is when they are heat treated, they retain targeted and beneficial impact. And so I basically use the analogy of it's like getting to the destination without needing to drive there, or just buying the apple pie without actually having to make it. Because there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you make an apple pie. Maybe you didn't buy enough apples. Maybe you put too much flour in. Maybe you didn't put the temperature right in the oven, right? There's a lot of variables that can actually impact that. And it's really a good analogy to understand postbiotics, because probiotics, there's a lot of fragility. There's stability issues. The biggest question in probiotics is like, does it survive? Well, does it need to survive? Because if it dies, there's still impact, but we have to study what that impact is so that we can actually then know the function that we're fulfilling. So this offers an incredible opportunity in the microbiome space to get the benefits and the microbiome modulation and the targeted impact without them needing to be alive. So you remove any stability guardrails or challenges. Everyone can get the benefits, because ultimately, one of the things that around probiotics is, it colonizes, but we know that's not true. Probiotics these are tourists. They come in, they do their job, and then they leave. So colonization is really something we don't understand yet when it comes to probiotics. But what we do understand is if we can modulate the microbiome, meaning support lowering inflammatory responses, helping with the gut barrier integrity, all these key components to what is needed to have a healthy functioning microbiome, the question of whether or not it needs to be alive is out there. And that's what a lot of researchers are working towards. In fact, we actually published a paper. It's in review right now, comparing one of our postbiotics with its live version. And we did these were all in vitro assays, organoid models, looking at different functions of the postbiotic. And it was either, in some assays, there was the same efficacy in the live version, but actually in many of the assays, the postbiotic had greater efficacy. And functions can change. So unless you actually do the research, unless you're actually trying to understand mechanistic insight, we don't know, but it opens up this really incredible opportunity in microbiome modulation and formulation. And we're just going to see more of it. It is kind of the next big space that the microbiome world is moving into.
Wow, thank you. Okay, that's a lot.
I told you.
Literally a lot to digest. Okay.
I know.
I love it. I love it. So now my question is, for our patients or clients, how do we know if they're a candidate for microbiome first approach to their metabolic health?
You know, I love that question because it really comes down to the conversation between you and your patient. And for me, like if I actually was just working with a patient the other day and they're sort of in that preconception of wanting to trial a GLP-1 medication. She's got some concerns, she had some fears, and she's been working on diet and exercise, and no one has really done any microbiome support. So we're starting there. It was something that she felt like, okay, I can do this. Let me give it a 3-month or 4-month or 6-month, whatever you kind of run through with your patient trial. And that felt really good to her. Whereas, you may have someone who's been doing a lot of metabolic support and you're maybe they are on weight loss medication and the microbiome just hasn't been addressed. Can this actually drive more success? So I think it really comes down to the conversation. I'm taking a very this is not a personal perspective. I'm always someone who works with my patient outside of what I may want them to do or what I think they should do. I have to meet them where they're at. So I think anyone who's thinking about or starting any metabolic journey, we should be really supporting the microbiome. And that's actually just my practice with a lot of my patients is I am someone, probably because I spent, 10 plus years in GI where when in doubt, I start with the gut because then upstream, because the microbiome is so foundational and does play such an integrated role in every system of the body, what does get better, what doesn't get better, because that can sometimes help me figure out my next sort of clinical direction or clinical course of action.
Perfect. So in addition to health history and having that conversation, really understanding where they're coming from, do you recommend any kind of testing to kind of find out what is needed for support, or when does that play a role? When do we need to be testing?
So I love data. Data is everything. I think obviously you have your metabolic profile and metabolic biomarkers from blood sugar, all these insulin, all these things that we know are showing signs of metabolic dysregulation. You also have health, like you mentioned, your health history, symptoms. I feel like I'm eating well and I'm drinking enough, but I have these intense cravings, or I'm not sleeping well. Again, these are all part of how we structure our care. I think when it comes to microbiome testing, I'm not someone who's always more data the better, because it really comes down to how you use that data. And I think you can really glean a lot from your patients and where they're at. And I think that's why when it comes to the microbiome, I love microbiome tests, and I think they can really help give insight into how the microbiome's functioning, especially depending on the types of tests we're using. But sometimes we look at the microbiome from a diagnostic lens, and that's not what the microbiome is. So I'll give a really good example, a strain that's talked a lot about is Akkermansia. And everyone's like, well, you don't have Akkermansia, so that means you have metabolic issues. Not necessarily. And actually newer research has come out to say you don't need to have Akkermansia to actually have a healthy microbiome. But if you are metabolically challenged or you've got real metabolic concerns, then there are certain forms that may actually play a role, or maybe you have to feed it, and that's where testing can sometimes be helpful. But that's where I think when we talk about precision formulations, it's carrying out that function. So if you've got someone who's got cravings or changes in appetite, or their metabolic outcomes are just not shifting despite a lot of, then they're really a good candidate for a microbiome metabolic precision product.
Okay. Now, I love that. And I love how you broke that down so eloquently, because I think we get overwhelmed as practitioners. We get overwhelmed. We're I think testing is the main thing that we need to do. We forget to ask the questions. And I think we really do need to come back to that, having a one-on-one conversation with our clients and patients to really understand what's their day-to-day life like, what's their history like, what's their stress like, because all of that impacts the microbiome.
And it's per patient. I always joke around and say that I'm not a diet first dietitian, which all the dietitians will sometimes But the reality is sometimes my patients aren't ready to address the diet. Sometimes they're it's the same thing. Even in microbiome care, I work with a ton of SIBO patients. Well, sometimes their microbiome's not actually ready for antimicrobial or antibiotic care. So we really do have to meet the patient where they're at. And that's where we have to adjust our patient care. So sometimes I start with tests because that's really what they need to get on board. Sometimes I start with supplements because that's where they feel more comfortable. And sometimes we start with diet, and sometimes we start with nothing and we're just talking and getting to know each other.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. Now, what are some of the common mistakes that you see practitioners make when they start working in the microbiome space? So they've learned about the microbiome, they're really excited to share this with their patients and clients. What are some of the mistakes you see?
I think that is such a good question. I don't know if I've actually even been asked that question, but I get a lot of like, what's the number one microbiome myth, right? Like that and a big one I think is that don't assume that someone has a healthy microbiome if they don't have GI issues, right? Because we know the microbiome is connected to every system from lung to brain to metabolic, and you don't necessarily have to have GI issues. GI issues can sometimes be the first signs that your microbiome is imbalanced or there's dysfunction, but it's not the only sign and symptom. I think the other thing too, in terms of some of the most common mistakes, especially when it comes like around microbiome testing, is again, kind of that diagnostic perspective. Like I call it the point and shoot method. Like, oh, you don't have this, so we need to reseed it. Or, oh, you have this and we need to kill it, because again, it's a dynamic ecosystem. So I would love for practitioners to, even when we're doing testing, but to really take a step back and say, okay, here's my patient, here's the symptoms or the conditions that they're showing up with. Yes, we know that's rooted in microbiome dysfunction. Here's maybe what a test is showing and how we start to use that. So I think we sometimes want to think black and white with the microbiome. And that's kind of like my main takeaway is we want to think black and white, and it is a lot of gray. And there's a lot that we don't understand, but we also have a lot of tools now and research now and formulations now that are available that can really start to shift the environment and the function of what we need the microbiome to do.
Okay, so we've worked with the practitioner. They are more aware of the functions that these probiotics and postbiotics perform. They are supporting the patients with, precision probiotics. How long do you tell practitioners to expect before they and their patients see meaningful changes? And what are they watching for? How do they decide something's working?
Yeah. And I think that, that's like the number one question I probably get from practitioners too, is like, oh, does this patient have to be on this forever? Depends, right? When we think about what's impacting the microbiome, right? What we call the exposome. We talk a lot about this in other areas of health, your modifiable risk factors versus non-modifiable ones like your genetics. When we think about the exposome, so from diet to lifestyle to medications to different not lifestyle, but life cycle changes. So what stage of life are we in? Are we starting with hormonal changes? Like all these things, sleep and stress, right? The air we're breathing, since most of us are living with really poor air quality right now, given all the fires, all of this can impact the function of the microbiome, the health of the microbiome. And so when we think about biotics and we think about microbiome modulation solutions that are available, it can take time. It really depends on the patient. One of the things that we look at in our products, we add herbs and vitamins and minerals, and those bioactives can actually sometimes enhance or help you feel some of the changes sooner. But actually, this is why I launched 60-day product line for practitioners only, because of this very question, in that microbiome modulation can sometimes take 30, 60, and most often 90 days to really start to see clinical meaningfulness. And I always say perceived benefits is different than what's happening. And this actually came out of, my years of working in GI, where a patient would come back, a month later and they're like, I don't really notice any changes in this. I don't know if this biotic's doing anything. I wanted, patients to have something that was more clinically meaningful, because most of our studies are done at an 8-week or 12-week, right? A 2-month or 3-month time period. And that's generally where we'll start to see those changes. So I always say you got to give it at least 60 days, but ideally 90 days to really get an understanding, and sometimes more. In fact, my mom takes our lung probiotics, she's had long-term lung issues. It kind of took her like 4 months to really have the perceived benefits of like less mucus and actually changes in her breathing. And so, but then I've had people that feel changes within a week. So can you feel digestive changes sooner? Yeah, more often you're going to have the digestive changes first because it's an oral biotic that's coming into the gut. So a lot of times digestive symptoms can improve faster than some of the peripheral that we're working on. So it's really per patient. And I always say, you got to give it 60 days minimum. I mean, you have to give some time. And then in regards to how long do you stay on it? Well, it depends on also what those risk factors are. Like someone like my mom who has asthma and poor lung architecture. I'm never taking her off our lung probiotic because she feels a difference, and it's not a condition that's going away. So I want her on it forever because it's decreasing some inflammation in her lungs. So I really just think it depends. And in regards to like our GLP-1 postbiotic, if someone, transitions off a medication or they're on it, and they're and they feel really good, great. Like try getting off of it. But if all of a sudden cravings start to creep back or weight starts to go up, it might be something they stay on. And I think it's not so much about going off or on, but it's really tailoring the product, the formulation, the biotic to what you're either currently struggling with in life or what you're proactively working to prevent.
Wonderful. Excellent explanation. So on that, can you tell us a little bit about a couple of your primary products? I would love to hear more about your lung probiotic, the GLP postbiotic, and then I know you have this beet powder formula thing that's pretty amazing too. So give us a little overview of some of those key products that you're sharing with us.
So at Res, we have 5 products. We're a small company and we do extensive research, as I've mentioned, in all of ours. But we launched initially with our lung probiotic. And I had mentioned, we're founded by a neonatologist, early lung microbiome researcher. And so this is really so much of his work. He's, a pulmonary expert. And I find the lung space really fascinating, even from a health perspective, because there's not a ton of pharmacological advancements. And so when you work with patients that have any kind of respiratory issues, you've got steroids, you've got rescue inhalers, but it's really hard for pulmonary medications to come in. And oftentimes, we have all these things from the air we breathe, that can drive inflammation in lungs, smoke and vape and all of these, and I feel like even COVID really highlighted and brought sort of front and center this lung and microbiome respiratory. And they've done studies looking back at worse outcomes linked back to worse microbiome. And so we know how much the microbiome can decrease resiliency to the lungs. But if you are someone who suffers from asthma or COPD, that's also rooted in microbiome dysfunction. So how do we start to improve upon that bidirectional communication? So our lung probiotic is 3 respiratory specific strains. It's an L. plantarum, rhamnosus, and acidophilus strains. These are our strains. And I found really interesting in one of our studies, we actually found, so I mentioned before how probiotic strains can compete. We actually found that our blend of strains outperformed any individual. So I like to say that our product, and then we combine turmeric, vasaka, and holy basil. So these ancient time-honored Ayurvedic herbs that actually are known to have immune and inflammatory and actually bronchodilation and respiratory support. We combined this all together, but we actually found that the blend of strains worked better. So our product really functions as the team. I like to say it's the Knicks, and it's not just Jalen Brunson, right? Like it's not one player on the team. It's the whole team that's performing and doing it. And we looked at various outcomes. We've done 2 clinical trials on this product in asthma and COPD, but so fascinating. We saw not just microbiome modulation, so increased short chain fatty acid production and changes in GI issues, but we actually saw and looked at those specific biomarkers related to respiratory health. So decreased sputum and serum levels of CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, MMP9, which is an enzyme. And in fact, I know clinicians are looking at MMP9 more. It's an enzyme, matrix metalloproteinase 9, that gets expressed in the extracellular various tissues in the body. So basically when it's overexpressed, you have tissue degradation and inflammation. There are certain lab tests out there that look at MMP9 in the gut. So for people using Vibrant Labs, but a lot of clinicians will actually measure this. This is a very prominent pulmonary marker. And so we saw reduced levels of MMP9 sputum and serum. We saw changes in FEV1, which is your lung function tests. And so really this product is working to not through the lens of the microbiome to decrease neutrophilic inflammation in the lungs. And so a really incredible product, super unique. We keep doing some ongoing. We just actually, we've had a pneumonia study going on with it. And I think it's really great. I think it's really good for anyone who's obviously struggling with any type of respiratory issue, your mold, your mycotoxin patients, right? Because there's a ton of respiratory concerns there. Your MAC patients who are on like long-term antibiotics and dealing oftentimes with bronchiectasis. But your allergy and your asthma, there's a lot of pathophysiology that's very similar from your immune expression. And I take it, I take it because I deal with terrible allergies, but I have a 4-year-old that brings home germs. So what am I doing to actually, so I really think of it as your 3-in-1 probiotic. It's gut support, it's immune support, and it's respiratory support.
And would you recommend that for any patient or, that
Oh,
kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great,
it sounds amazing.
I think it's great. And again, it's very targeted. It doesn't mean that it's,
right.
and that's the other thing, like as a practitioner and as you specialize in this space, you start to build the unique garden or the unique, community that you want. So I actually take various biotics because for certain needs and things, I have allergies. I'm like kind of a histamine person. So I'm doing a lot from an immune perspective. I've got eosinophilic esophagitis, which is asthma of the esophagus. So I love our ResB because I'm trying to do a lot to like lower my allergy, threshold. But I take other biotics too, because I'm also a 39-year-old woman who's going to be entering that next, lovely chapter of life. And what am I doing to support my hormone and hormone metabolism? So I really think that's how we have to start to think of biotics.
Okay, perfect. So tell us a little more about the GLP postbiotics specifically, because I think people really want to know how that works. When do I recommend it? How do I use this in practice?
Yeah, so the GLP-1 postbiotic, this is a heat-treated L-plantarum strain. We combine it with, not Vesica, that's in our lung. We combine it with white mulberry, fenugreek, chromium picolinate, vitamin D3. We did in vitro, so we did organoid models looking specifically at GLP-1 production. So is this from not just the biotics and not just the postbiotic, but does the blend, do these actually have impact on increasing endogenous GLP-1? And they did in vitro. And I'm really excited because we are in publication review for our clinical trial. It's a first of its kind clinical trial that took a postbiotic with bioactives. And we saw a significant increase in endogenous GLP-1. And that correlated with significant reduction in food cravings and more than 30% reduction in food cravings, which you would anticipate seeing, right? And we understand that because we saw that in vitro. So it was great that obviously it was replicated. But I thought even more shocking in the study was we actually saw statistically significant weight loss. So we saw on average, participants lost 6 pounds by 6 weeks. So you asked about timeline. Which I think is important. So we actually saw clinical meaningfulness and statistical changes at the 6-week mark, which was cool. Like, because it actually kind of answers that question of how long. Not everyone, but obviously that's where we started to see significant change. But I thought the weight loss was fascinating because, again, it's not a GLP-1 medication, but what that tells me from a mechanistic perspective is we improved metabolic optimization. We improved the body's signaling. And now the body actually is optimizing that production to actually receive those signals and turn off those hunger, the turn off the hunger, increase the satiety, and that it actually translated into pretty profound weight loss. I mean, listen, I'll take 6 pounds any day.
Totally. Yes, it's amazing. Thank you for that one.
Yeah.
Talk about the beet.
Yes. So we have a prebiotic. This is a precision prebiotic. It's a resistant potato starch. So what I love about resistant potato starch, as I mentioned before, it's not super predominant in the diet. I may eat a green banana, 1 or 2 days a week. What's great about this product combines beetroot and methylated B12. So it's great for energy, endothelial support, but it's FODMAP friendly. So it's Monash certified. So what I struggle with prebiotics is so much, and especially working in GI, we're either removing them because we need people to feel better. So we bridge them with a low FODMAP diet, or I've had people come to me and they're on FODMAP diet for years and years and years, which we know lowers microbial diversity. So this becomes a really important product to start feeding the terrain, start feeding the environment where you're not going to add to any fermentation or add to any gas or bloating, because so much of your prebiotics can contribute in someone who has digestive distress. So I think this is a great product to start with for anyone, whether they have GI issues, but really starts to feed specifically your bifido, Akkermansia, lactobacilli. And we've done those internal studies to actually, the preclinical studies to look at the finished product in microbial diversity as well as nitric oxide production. And we did actually a really cool study where we did the beet product, the ResG, the pre-beet prebiotic with the ResM, and we saw significant changes in food cravings, really kind of that foundation plus targeted support. So I really think of prebiotics as just being part of it. I'm not a huge fan of synbiotics when they're in the same capsule, actually, because do you have an efficacious amount of that prebiotic, an amount that is actually modulating? It's not bad, but I wouldn't necessarily, if you're taking a symbiotic or you're using symbiotics in practice, I wouldn't let that just be your prebiotic that you give people, because you want an efficacious amount that's actually supporting diversity and short chain fatty acid production and all of that. And then from there, we have two other products. We have a perimenopause postbiotic, which we actually just wrapped up our clinical trial. And that combines black cohosh and chaseberry. So really working through the lens of the estrobolome, your estrogen microbiome. So the group of bacteria that are responsible for estrogen metabolism and balance. So as estrogen gets packaged up to be excreted, the microbiome's role in this group of bacteria is to put some back into circulation and excrete the rest. But during perimenopause, which is a 6 to 10 year period, right, your hormones are fluctuating so rapidly that estrobolome efficiency gets thrown off. I use the analogy of like the I Love Lucy scene where she's like packaging up
all the time.
and then it's like so many of it, right? That's like our estrobolome. It's like And you can have too much estrogen in 1 hour and not enough in the next hour. And so we looked at actually biomarkers related to specifically the estrobolome. And we just wrapped up our clinical trial where we also did vaginal assays. And so more to come on that. I can't share. It's in data analysis now. But a really cool product that you're getting, again, all of our products are getting dual action, right? You're getting that specific microbiome support, but then you're obviously getting that system specific impact. And then we have a bone and joint. So really looking at mobility and flexibility, our postbiotic with boswellia, MSM, glucosamine chondroitin, bromelain. So really supporting inflammation that we know targets the bones. We looked at things like CTX, which is a marker of bone turnover. We looked at reduction of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So again, really trying to understand more of that system-specific impact. And that clinical trial is actually just in data analysis now.
Oh, this is wonderful. This is exciting. So for practitioners who are listening and are just getting their interest piqued about this, they want to go deeper after today. Where do they start with ResBiotic? Is there anything you want to share? How do they get in touch with you? How do they learn more? All of the things.
Yep. So I always welcome people to come to our website. On our website, resbiotic.com, we have a for healthcare practitioner portal. So you just you go there and you can drop into our portal, sign up for it. That gives you access. I've got tons of resources from protocols to all of our science sheets, any research that's available. I always link there, a way to get in contact with us. We do offer wholesale pricing. And as I mentioned before, we offer practitioners exclusively a 60-day product line, again, for more patient adherence, more clinical meaningfulness. We offer wholesale pricing. We're available on FullScript. We do tons of webinars, tons of education, that we're constantly trying to educate, especially, being in this field for a while. I think for me, that's one of my biggest passions. It's not just educating on our science. We have great science. It's cool, but really on like staying at the forefront of the microbiome world and how we can translate that to real clinical practice. Because when you start to come across, there's this probiotic and this company, like how do we actually start to dissect that?
Yeah. Amazing. Okay. It looks like we had a question come in, so I want to make sure we ask this. For a practitioner who has clients currently taking a GLP-1 medication like Ozempic or Wegovy and wanting to explore a more natural long-term approach, how do you recommend having the conversation, and what does a responsible transition protocol look like?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question.
Right?
Yeah. And I think I often say like, this is a more natural approach, but I actually take it from foundational, like on a drug, off a drug, like the microbiome should be part of the conversation, because most people in general, all of us probably have dysbiosis. And how is that specific translation of dysbiosis, imbalance in the microbiome, driving the chronic conditions or the symptoms or the issues that we're obviously coming to see the practitioners for? And I think that's a healthier way to have a conversation around, well, it's amazing you're on a GLP-1, maybe you're seeing success and you've been working on diet and exercise. Here's a piece of the puzzle that becomes really important in your success and in your own metabolic journey, and it's the microbiome, because your microbiome governs the production of all of these important appetite signaling molecules. And so it's not so much like I want natural, or I don't want this, or I feel a certain way about a drug. It's just really about the microbiome's role in metabolic health and how we can add this as a very important tool. So I generally will get patients, if they're not on something, I generally will start them at least 90 days before they're wanting to deprescribe and before you start transitioning dose, so that we can get some really good microbiome support happening. And in fact, in our studies, we saw 6 weeks. So I would say at least, 2 months before you start that transition, because as you start transitioning down from these medications, of course, you're stopping taking something that is such a high level, but we want to make sure then we're adding something in that's going to support those cravings and support appetite and satiety. And so I would definitely get started on it at that sort of 8-week period, and then start deprescribing or lowering dose and seeing how they respond from there.
Amazing. Thank you. We have one last question I want to get to before we wrap up. What specific biomarkers, labs, and wearable data points would you recommend monitoring alongside your recommendations to build a measurable before and after picture that demonstrates the protocol is actually working?
That's a great question. And for each product, obviously it will be different, but taking taking the GLP-1. So one thing that I do, because I do think data is important for patients also to understand if something's really helping. So I love like food questionnaire surveys. I think those are really important to really gauge cravings and food noise. Obviously we don't measure things like GLP-1 clinically. We did see metabolic biomarker changes. It was only a 2-month study, but we saw A1C starting to trend down. Again, weight for me is one of those ones where weight's just one biomarker of metabolic health, right? Because we have obviously a whole cohort of people that are skinny fat, right? Like that have a lower BMI. So I think from a wearable perspective, because what else plays a role in metabolic? Are we sleeping well? I think that's an important piece. Cortisol becomes a very important piece too in this, because we know the microbiome plays such. So these are all, I think, certain biomarkers or outcomes that we can look at. But I think so much of the story too is like, how do we feel, right? And I think for a patient to see that is really important too, because obviously, depending on what else you're doing, it all plays a role. But yeah, I mean, obviously outside of just your typical metabolic markers, I think because again, like we don't measure GLP-1 clinically.
Right.
We do it in lab and in research, but we're not measuring it clinically. So again, blood sugar is a big one. And food cravings, food noise, weight, I think is a great one. Changes in body composition are always good too. Energy is a big part of our metabolic system. So are we sleeping better? Do we feel more rested? I think these are, and again, your wearables can obviously show that over time.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been a really fun discussion. I hope people are loving this information. Thank you for diving deep and simplifying at the same time. That's hard to do, to give us lots of information, but make it manageable. I love your analogies about the neighborhood, about the dogs. This is great because everybody can relate to that and be like, oh, this is a great analogy I can use with my patients and clients. I want to thank everybody who joined us today and asked questions. If you're watching this as a replay, remember you can post your comments in and we'll get those questions answered anytime. Thanks so much for joining us, Kara. I'm so happy to have spent this hour with you and learned so much from you. And as mentioned, you can go to ResBiotic.com. Is there anywhere else you want them to direct?
Yeah, so come to ResBiotic. Again, we do lots on social media, Instagram. We post a lot. We do a lot of education. But I also want to say that we have a really exciting practitioner innovation summit that we're doing alongside other brands, Biocanic's included. But this is a really great opportunity for practitioners to join in on August 12th. And I'm sure they'll be
posted. Yes.
Yep, we'll get it posted. But we've brought together really some of the newer innovative companies, I think, that are doing some really unique things in this space. We all go to conferences. Maybe we talk to a company. Maybe we talk to someone. It's 2 minutes here. We forget them, but it's a way to come and just really learn about some of the cool stuff that I think is leading the innovation in this space. And so I really encourage everyone to come. We'll be there. You'll be there. Tiny Health. We've got transcriptions and STEM Regen and Biome Learning Center. And we've got some other practitioners joining in. So
it's going to be great. Well, Kara, thank you so much for your time today. And thanks everyone for joining us today for the podcast.
Thank you.